Okay, we got a special guest this week. We'll let you introduce yourself, and just in case you know, we just jump in real hot. So we never introduce the show or anything. We assume a lot of our listenership. So let people know kind of what you do, your get down. You got a fun podcast. We're cross promoting, and I enjoy your insights. Honestly, I call you and talk to you, and I like you.
Yeah, thanks, Lukey. Thanks first and foremost for having me on. Enjoy our chats as well. My name is Milo. You can find me on Twitter at Pod and Weave, which is also the name of my podcast. Predominantly and kind of initially started out as strictly a betting show, but we kind of delve more into like the world of boxing. So we break down everything British, domestically here in America, otherwise. So yeah, we try to keep it loose and fun and all that good stuff. So yeah, thanks again for having me. Looking forward to chopping it up.
Okay, let's not bury the lead. We got to talk about Dan Azeez. Give us a history lesson. Give us about what we missed. Okay.
Yeah, so I messaged you last week. I think I was a little more on fire then about what happened than I am now, having had time to like ingest it. But yeah, essentially, so he fought Louis Edmondson for some sort of title last weekend, and I'm a Dan Azeez sympathizer. I'm a fan of his. If I feel like if you're a guy or a gal who likes these fighters who really get it out the mud and do it kind of on their own, minimal promotional backing, he's someone you kind of have to root for. I had a feeling something was off when I'm on Twitter like all the time. So I got these notifications earlier in the day that Louis Edmondson sold so many tickets that this fight, which was initially tabbed as a co-headliner, a co-feature, was actually going to happen after the main event because they didn't want all of Louis' fans to leave. So that right away was kind of interesting. It seems a bit favorable optics-wise to the younger fighter from Ben Shalom. It's one of those interesting business side of boxing fights. Ben Shalom, boxer, ostensibly represents both of these guys, but gun to Ben's head, he would probably just tell you he wants Louis to win. Younger, probably more marketable fighter. So a lot of things are going against him. I happened to watch that fight. I thought it was competitive enough, I suppose, but clear Azeez, by any rubric, by any metric, whatever style of boxing fan you are. And they gave it to Louis. And it was really cynical. I think where every now and then you think you're coming out of the dark ages with some of the judging hijinks and some of the business bleeding into the actual results of the boxing you watch. And I just feel that results like that make boxing feel less of a sport and more of a something else, a business enterprise, like something, that isn't entirely on the level. Like I was talking to a friend about it who doesn't like boxing, who doesn't know anything about boxing. And I was trying to explain it to him in terms he'd understand. And I was saying like, all right, let's say, the teams that reached the World Series happen to be the Guardians and the Diamondbacks. Like Major League Baseball wouldn't like that, but there'd be nothing in the way of it happening. If the teams just win the games, that would be the World Series we get. And I feel like this is a case where two teams, in this case, competed. One of them won, and then outside forces made it so that one of the teams or people didn't advance. Left a real bad taste in my mouth. Azeez is of an age coming off a tough draw and now a loss, and he's really having to assess his options. If he continues his career, he's got fewer options than he did before when he already wasn't in a great spot. So yeah, had time to process it. Not quite as I think you would have gotten a much more animated rant last weekend right after it happened, but it just sucks basically. I think Azeez got jobbed, and yeah.
Let me do some reporter questions, right? So let's talk through. It sounds like you've gone through some of the stages of grief already.
Yeah.
When did you first hear about like, hey, it's going to be on after in a weird way? When did you first hear about that?
Yeah, it was during the undercard. It was like the early undercard. Boxer took their time kind of posting the running order. And when they did, that's when you saw that notification like, hey, Azeez Edmondson's going to be taking place after O'Hara Davies and Adam Azim. And I was like, that's kind of suspect. And then I saw that corroborated from accounts like Sam Jones, who we saw a lot of this week. He's the manager of Jack Catterall. And yeah, it's one of those moves that makes sense, I suppose, to the promoter. You don't, I was just at Michaela Marin and Sandy Ryan, and that was a fight where a lot of people left before the main event because neither fighter's from New York. Probably a lot of tickets were sold on undercard fighters, and you want to avoid a TV product where you show the main event and the venue's more or less empty. So I kind of get it from that standpoint, but I have a hard time seeing it as anything but favoritism, basically, toward one of the fighters in what should ostensibly be a true 50-50.
Yeah, I mean, that boxing definitely always, it's like, oh yeah, we're going to do, like, that's the thing about Pro Box that does a great job is Pro Box, I feel like, is making 50-50 fights, and they're not, quote unquote, investing in a fighter. They're investing in good fights. I think where boxing gets tricky is it's hard to make a 50-50 fight when someone's invested in a fighter because there's like a natural inclination for you to want that investment to pay off.
And I think also to your point, because I watch a lot of Pro Box as well. I watch like everything, but there have been fights in which the fighter that Pro Box would want to win and invest in, the case I'm thinking of is like one of the Valle brothers had a close fight and it didn't go his way. I think it was against Damian Sosa. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah. It was Valle Sosa, very close fight, and then Valle lost a split to Sosa, which I think speaks to how good the product is you're getting a fair fight.
I think so. Yeah. And it speaks to the point of sometimes, I suppose there are promoters where, you might have the best laid plans and Vi is going to win and go on to do X, Y, and Z. But if he loses in a clear-cut way by any way you slice and dice it, then he's got to take the loss. And that's just the way it goes. So I think that would be, that would be something in Pro Box's favor. It was just a bit of a blemish on what was otherwise a pretty fun card that Boxer produced last weekend.
Well, tell me about this undercard because Dakota's gearing up, revving his horses to get on here soon. And to be honest with you, I know about the Campbell Hatton fight, and I know a little bit. I don't understand what the hell happened with this Reese Bolotny thing. Why don't you just give the uninformed American, give us what we should know about this undercard?
Cool. Why don't I start off with Bellotti and Gomez, because that's the most interesting and kind of confusing thing, I think, to a lot of the laymen who might not follow this sort of thing. So essentially, that fight was going to be a banger. Reese Bellotti has had this Indian summer, reeling off win after win. I think a lot of people, myself included, probably wrote him off for dead after he got stopped early by Ray Ford. But he's had this resurgence. He's doing it the tough way, kind of 10 and 12 round decision, one after the other. And he's primed to fight Michael Gomez Jr. I actually fancied Gomez Jr.'s chances quite a bit in that fight. Thought it was a pretty favorable stylistic matchup for him. And then you just hear during the Pat McCormick fight on the broadcast, we're getting notification that due to medical reasons, Michael Gomez can't fight. Turned out to be some sort of kidney infection. I've got no insight into the legitimacy. I think you can only believe that he was actually ill. As someone who was tracking this fight pretty carefully during fight week, I thought it was odd that they had a presser and a face-off in which Gomez wore a mask that covered pretty much his entire face. So that could be either a fashion statement or maybe he was just actually
that
very
was weird
ill.
Because I couldn't actually upload the photos until I double taked because I'm not going to lie, I'm not the biggest, most knowledgeable guy of his career. So I'm trying to look at BoxRec and identify him. And I'm like, wait, he's the guy wearing a mask. I couldn't figure it out until I had to rewatch. So a little peek behind the curtain. I'm sure everyone wants to hear how I put up photos. I watched the press conference if I don't know the fighters because the press conferences are usually boring. And that's how I was like, that's weird. But I assumed there's this gangster image, rap culture's big, and I thought that it was going to be some corny cringe. The card was stand on business. That's a gangster phrase. And they made a gangster phrase kind of look a little weird and not gangster. So I just interpreted it as cringy gangster culture being brought to boxing.
It may have been that, because if you've also followed Gomez's career a little bit, you know that it's been stop and start. He's also a little bit of a knucklehead, I might say. He had a fight versus Levi Giles, I think his name is, where they faced off, and Gomez, not just a get off me shove, full on shoved him across the stage. and I'm sure he was fined and all that. But the fight went ahead, and I think another commission. We've seen fights scrapped for less. I think there was a UFC fight either last year or the year before where something similar happened. A guy full force shoved someone
rib or something. I vaguely remember it was like halfway carrying.
In the UFC case, I think the guy actually suffered a concussion because he like got shoved full force and then jerked. Once someone like caught him and the fight was scrapped. So Gomez, yeah, he's a hothead. It's really disappointing that fight was going to be the one that like carries the card, where it's like the main event, Catterall-Prograis, maybe not the best stylistic matchup, but this co-main can't miss at all. And then it wound up being scrapped, and it was just a big disappointment for all. Yeah.
So while we're doing this, shout out my guy Ian Green. He left a comment, real boxers watching the show. That's cool. He said, hope all is well and grinding. My co-host Dakota is on. Dakota, say hello to our good friend Milo, who's helping us understand British boxing.
Milo, what's good, my guy? Good to meet you.
Likewise, big fan of your content, Slip and Weave. Really enjoy your interviews. So cool.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, I really appreciate that, bro. Thank you.
Yeah, we're like a multiverse. We're trying to do that Marvel thing where we're putting like-minded guys together, but instead of like for corporate greed, and we don't want like people to die, so we can't bring them back. We're just trying to cross-platform promote each other's, I'd say, hardcore boxing enthusiasts. So back to the lead. Gomez has kind of done weird things in his career, and then not unlike the Dan Azeez story you told us earlier, the night of the fight, we hear he has a kidney infection and he can't fight.
Yeah, and I'll wrap it up soon because I know we got other undercard stuff to get to. But I think a highlight, if you're listening to this and you've got no idea who Reese Bellotti is or no idea who Michael Gomez Jr., watch the clip of Eddie Hearn and Ale Oladipo interviewing Reese Bellotti after that cancellation, because I strongly suspect they thought they were going to get politician Reese, diplomatic Reese, who's like, hey, I mean, we're fighters and these things happen. And it was very much not that. He went super off script and tore Gomez a new one on national TV. And yeah, it didn't take long at all for DAZN to put on that "we're sorry for offensive language" banner.
We're sorry for state-run TV didn't go our way.
Exactly. So that would be a highlight of the night. I really hope Eddie sorted Reese out. That'd be bullshit. Sorry, I don't know if I can curse on here, but
do whatever you want.
Okay, whatever the fuck you want on this show.
Yeah. All right.
Here's a fun club show version of that I got for you. Did you hear about Samuel Arnold? He was going to fight in Canada, and then he had some type of condition mid-flight, and then got checked into a hospital and made a post from his IG, but the fight got canceled. It was a step-up fight against a 9-1 fighter, and so two different medical things,
Yeah, and these things happen. I just hope the promoters don't use it as an excuse to withhold pay from the people who showed up and did their jobs. Especially someone like Bellotti, same as Azeez. If you followed his career, he's had a very circular path to where he's at now in this position of prominence. So really hope they gave him his show money.
And we're grilling you, so I'm going to keep asking questions. So, hey, Dakota, jump in, grill him. He knows a lot about UK, so we just got to ask him uncomfortable questions. It's called the hot seat.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you know how we do it. So, I got the sense that Gomez was kind of being billed as the guy to win. I didn't see a lot of Bellotti content. Am I wrong or right in that perspective?
It's a little column A, little column B. I mean, like, Bellotti is not a sexy entity if you're a promoter. He's a guy with some mileage. He's suffered KO losses before. He's a workmanlike guy who's got out of the mud, like I said before, about his ease, which is great, but I don't know if that translates into box office money. Gomez is the son of a very well-known professional boxer. He's got that going for him. He's got the prettier record. I think he also happens to have a very fan-friendly style. If you guys haven't seen the Kane Baker fight, Kane Baker is a tough guy. He's gotten stopped before, but Gomez leveled him and put him out cold. And it was that was the fight preceding this one. So, I think if that fight went ahead and Gomez wins, cool. Eddie Hearn can get behind him. I'm sure there's money to be made. But if Reese Bellotti got the best of him, you can slide Reese in with any number of names on the domestic scene, or even use him as an opponent for a fighter more on the world stage. So I think that fight was more about filling the arena, which I understand they had trouble with. It didn't look pretty on the broadcast, frankly. They tried to hide it, and like DAZN commentators were talking about like, oh, fans are still filtering in, but there was one fight in particular where like Junaid Boston is walking in, and they used one particular camera angle that had like a litany of empty seats, and I was like, oh boy, like we're already in the main card. This is not something you want to be showing off. So to answer your question, I think Eddie could have worked with either outcome, frankly.
Okay, and then any other? I'm trying to think. Like we got a Jimmy Joe Flint, which is what I call Dakota some days. He beat Campbell Hatton again. So I mean that, you know.
Yeah, no, I loved it. That was going to be like a spiel that I kind of had in the tank, but Campbell Hatton, I'm sure he's a lovely guy. His presence in the sport, it's not like we've got no room for rich kids in boxing. There've been plenty of Chris Algieri's who make it perfectly fine and have really successful careers for themselves. But Campbell Hatton just rubbed me the wrong way. I didn't like, in particular, that this rematch was a matter of when, not if. He was talking in the lead up to this fight as if it's just a birthright. Well, of course I'm going to get this win back. Why wouldn't I? Meanwhile, if you follow his career, in one of his first fights, he robbed this Spaniard named Sonny Martinez blind. Terrible robbery. And where's that rematch? Never happened because Sonny Martinez doesn't have a dad named Ricky Hatton. And also I was at this show, kind of a off topic, but I was at this show that I think ProBox carried this week, where it was like Miyo Yoshida versus Sha Metcalf.
The New York show. Yeah.
Right. And I remember watching Kynell Wheeler versus this Polish fella who sold a lot of tickets.
Who just ran around the ring.
Terrible. I guess it's just my personal opinion.
You're blending right in, bub. You're sounding like us. You're fitting right in.
Oh, cool. Thanks. Yeah, it's my 2 cents, but I feel like I can't see any outcome other than Wheeler 59-55, maybe 58-56, and he gets jobbed on scorecards. And I bring it back to the Campbell Hatton thing because it's like, we're probably not going to see Kynell Wheeler again, at least not in a money fight. There's no rematch because why would Conrad whatever agree to it? But for someone like Campbell Hatton, he just gets, a full camp with the best circumstances handed to him on a silver platter. Wasn't necessarily the most respectful to Jimmy Joe Flint in the lead up to this fight. And Flint's a guy with a family and a kid, and he's got a job outside of boxing. He had to take a fight after his initial win over Hatton. He had to take a small hall fight, which he lost just for the money because he needs like money to put food on the table. So I thought the whole thing was a little stinky, and I was frankly kind of glad to see Hatton take a loss. I think it restores some order to like the natural ecosystem of boxing, where
to add to what you're saying, like I think it speaks to like the talent and experience gap between the two, that Campbell Hatton gets whatever 6 months off, he gets a full camp, whatever healing time he needs. This guy's losing a club fight, he's working a job, and he's still better. And I think that as much as like I've enjoyed Campbell Hatton's fights, and I do think he's gotten progressively better, but there are certain things that he's inevitably going to get favorable calls and favorable circumstances and situations. And, sometimes that maybe overshadows the lack of talent because other guys, are having to deal with other stuff outside of the ring in addition to their boxing career, where him as a young fighter, he can just focus on that. You know what I mean? But I'm definitely not seeing a pace of development right now that's like a championship fighter, but I just think he's a good time.
And I think he's also, Ricky Hatton meant a lot to a lot of fans. And it's a great, like for a lot of people now that have a little bit more money, but they want to relive their 20s. This is a way to see Ricky Hatton. And he looks like Ricky. He just doesn't have the same skill sets. And that's fine. And I think that I think that a lot of the bad behavior, the trash talk, I think that's nerves from inexperience. I don't think that's an indictment on him. I think that what that shows me is when most people get nervous, they start talking. So when I hear guys talking, I don't listen and go, okay, he said he's going to do this and that. I always think that that's an inexperienced fighter kind of showing their hand. And I think we're just kind of seeing at this point, he started late. He's bonding with his dad. He's going through a career. There's nothing wrong with just getting to this point, but I think it's going to be hard to get past this point. And I think part of it too is the TV attention that comes with the name. So you're getting the attention that other hardworking fighters haven't gotten.
Yeah, and if I can add just like one more thing onto just the nature of this fight, it's not even like the favoritism ends in the ring. After the loss, all of the company men, all the people who benefit from their association with Matchroom are like treating it like a funeral. Like Tony Bellew and what's his face, Anthony Fowler on Twitter. Like, I'm gutted for Campbell Hatton. He worked so hard. It's like a guy won a fight. You know, it's not like someone died here. Like Jimmy Joe Flint trained hard, took an L after beating Campbell Hatton, and then beat him fair and square. And there was only one outcome. I thought it was even wider than the first fight, which frankly wasn't particularly close in my mind. So yeah, it's just boxing is a sport of the haves and have-nots. And I'm kind of glad that the have-nots, that sanity prevailed for at least just one day in this kind of crooked sport.
I like a name like Jimmy Joe Flint. You can't really be like not a tough guy, I think, if you go by Jimmy Joe.
Yeah, he rules. Yeah, he seems really cool. Down-to-earth guy. Was more than accommodating to Campbell after the fight. A lot of hugs, a lot of what looked like pep talks in the ring. You know, probably telling him along the lines of like,
that must suck though, to get beat and then a guy puts his arm around you and start like, didn't Bernard used to do that to guys? Bernard used to be the king of that. He'd beat Kelly Pavlik and then he'd put his arm around him and go, you got to train with this type of fighter. Like, that must really suck.
It must suck, but it's like, do you want that or do you want Caleb Plant digging a shovel as you're like unconscious? So it's like, I don't know.
Like that's better. Like, I feel like in a weird way, that's less humiliating than just getting surgically beaten and then the guy beating you so badly he's going to give you coaching advice.
It's even more humiliating when they do it before the decision gets announced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that hug and like raising your arm. Hey,
like, yeah, you
hey, give it up for this guy, huh?
The pre-announcement arm raise. Yeah, that's always a rough call. Any other undercards that we should care about?
Yeah, I just noted a couple of ones that could be of interest. So for your purposes, Lukey, in one of our calls, you mentioned you're high on Jimmy Sains, who's also a Matchroom fighter. On the YouTube undercard, we saw Steve Clark, who is young in his career, but he has a notable amateur win over Jimmy Sains. So I don't think that signing is a coincidence. I thought he looked fine over this guy, Mateusz Pawlowski. Frankly, I think one of them is trending up, Sains, and one of them is either treading water or trending down in Steve Clark. So I would just say keep an eye out for that fight in 2025. If it turns out that Matchroom starts to lose belief in Clark or just views him as a glorified ticket seller, wouldn't shock me at all if we see that fight next year. It'll sell money. It'll sell tickets. One of these like domestic dust-ups that they love to have in the UK. So I would keep an eye on Clark versus Jimmy Sains next year for sure. That would help put Sains over. We saw the debut of Emily Whitworth, decorated amateur. She trains with Kieran Farrell, who also oversees Daniel Dubois. Not much to take away from her pro debut. She outweighed her opponent by 8 pounds. So just kind of hossed her for 4 rounds.
That's the difference between me and Dakota, in case the listeners are wondering.
It was about 8 pounds. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just 8 pounds between me and Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna guess it's more, Bob. I'm gonna guess
it's just 8 pounds, bro. So if you rough me up, you're just 8 pounds bigger.
Yeah, and I don't bring that fight up just because like, oh, her debut was so great. It's also, I kind of a spiel, like it concerns me a little bit when someone this young, she's 19, you know, very good amateur career, but she's 19 years old. Concerns me a little bit when someone of that tender age signs with a big promoter. In 2024, if a big promoter signs you, you're only fighting on their shows. Doesn't matter the promoter. We see it with Top Rank. We see it with all these other outfits, and I don't know if Matchroom is holding enough shows to get her the necessary experience, development, whatever you want to call it. So I kind of hope they buck this trend and maybe farm her out to some of the smaller like promoters like Steve Goodwin, John Clark, some of these other folks in the UK who hold shows at York Hall more regularly. I think it could be mutually beneficial to get her more ring time and not just reliant on fighting every time Matchroom has a show in the UK, which is kind of increasingly rare during these Saudi times.
He's making us look like freaking casuals, Dakota, when it comes to UK boxing.
I'm sorry to bore half your audience.
No,
No,
you're not boring. This is that knowledge. Dakota, you got your mic muted.
I know, but I wasn't saying anything.
That's what I was saying. What do we got to say about Regis Catterall?
Yeah, Dakota, you want to take this away?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I thought that Jack fought a really great fight. You know, he's really smart about controlling his distance, letting that right hand go in a variety of different ways, or the left hand, I should say, 2 southpaws in this one. You know, we were going into this one, we're kind of wondering, what does Regis have left, right? It's been a while. We haven't seen him since the Haney fight. That was a rough fight for him to go through, very one-sided. Time off after, but back with Bobby Benton. And I just think that at the end of the day, the things that have always like limited Regis, like the only moving to the right, all those things still exist. Those never got corrected. And now I think he's starting to get older legitimately as a fighter. And so those technical flaws, especially against a guy like Catterall, are just starting to get a little bit more glaring. Like when you're in the top 10 and you're throwing so hard that you fall over. I just think that, you know, his ability to get himself in position to punch has just gotten kind of complicated just because of his feet and maybe a certain loss of timing. But, you know, I think Catterall is one of the best that the division has to offer right now. It's not the most exciting style in the world in terms of action, but when you look at skill level, it just feels like he is one of the guys of this moment.
Yeah, I think he's one of the best guys in the division. My big takeaway on this one was, we're going to remember in the 9th round, but Regis was doing pretty friggin' good up until about the 7th round. Like, he was in there, and I think we were both right in the preview, Dakota. I think people were underestimating the will and how there could be a hangover for Catterall. But then I think I underestimated the skill of Catterall, who in that second half, where he sensed this could be a tougher fight, he gets dropped. I was wondering if he would have some issues, right? Some mental challenges. And how did he behave? He behaved like a champion. He really put it on Regis. He stepped it up. He had that great 9th round. And that 9th round changed this fight, right? That the way he handled that 9th round completely took any drama out of this.
Well, and he also made his punching power a factor in the fight, right? He didn't get a knockout. He doesn't have a lot of knockouts, but he made the fact that he can put Regis on his ass a factor in the fight.
Milo, what do you think?
Yeah, I kind of was hoping you guys could take the wheel on that. My thoughts are kind of fleeting. I'm just sad Regis lost. I'm a fan of his, a lot of fun moments in his career. I think ultimately he made a lot of hay out of the skills that he had. I'm happy for him in his career, if that's the end of it. Happy for him for taking the loss like a capital C champ. That's how you take a loss, giving full flowers to Catterall, no excuses. Probably something Devin Haney can learn from. Yet I know you guys aren't as like terminally online as I am, but he was having Twitter fingers the whole fight, like, oh, I ruined Regis, and just talking insane shit toward a good fighter.
That's just not class either.
No. So yeah, sad for the outcome. I mean, you guys don't really follow like betting trends too heavily, I'm assuming, but Regis, to your point,
give it to us.
I forget which one of you made the point as far as like how close Regis was at one point. There was a time in the fight where, you know, they hang live odds during these fights, and Regis was like a pick'em. Like, he was trending toward winning this fight at one point. And then it's just kind of sad, frankly. His age gives way. You see his chin being more susceptible than we've seen in years past. I think the Zorilla fight was maybe a kind of precursor to that. You know, I was actually at the venue in NOLA when he fought Zorilla, and there was a moment in that fight where it was ruled a slip when Zorrilla hit him and Prograis hit the deck. And I think any replay would show that it was a clean knockdown. And maybe that could have been kind of a hint, if more of us, myself included, were paying attention, that this may not just coast to a lackadaisical 12-round decision like a lot of us thought. So I'm just bummed for Regis. I hope he makes the best of his post-fighting career. No interest in seeing him in BKFC, like he said after the fight. Like, if he needs it for the money, God bless. But like, I want to see a guy like that help the next generation and stop taking punches, frankly.
I want to see him be like a podcast personality. He's such a reasonable person and a good guy. And I feel like the thing about Regis is that I like is he's so dignified. We have a lot of these fighters nowadays, and we say class or stuff, but I want to use the word dignified. And because we have a lot of people who lose and then they try to kind of, well, there's an excuse, or just wait and wait. And with Regis, what's so endearing to me is he reminds me of these old school fighters who they feel like losing's part of the process. He never made excuses. He always gave the other guy credit. And I think that his legacy is probably going to outlast famous fighters right now that we look at. Arguably, his legacy could outlast Catterall's in a funny way, because he conducted himself in such a way that the fans connected with him.
Completely agree. I think it's kind of silly, and I find it amusing when like Eddie Hearn, who is Catterall's promoter, talks after the fight about this guy's so underrated. He's such an underrated fighter. And it's like, all right, well then what's your job? What does a promoter do if not to promote talent and make sure people aren't underrated? So it's all well and good to be like, hey, Teofimo Lopez, come over to Manchester, which I'm sure Teofimo's dying to get on the next flight to fight in a half-empty arena in Manchester. Like, you know, Catterall's a very good fighter. I think Eddie just has a lot of work to do to build his profile. And you could say the same for Boots and, frankly, like a lot of guys in his stable.
Well, and if he is underrated, a big part of why he's underrated is losing the first decision to Taylor and then having such a length of inactivity of that rematch not happening at least 3-4 times. So I think that's, if he's underrated, that's the biggest reason.
And I think also the other issue is he's built. Oh, don't even worry. We just jump all over each other. This is not professional. The range fighters, fencers, he's a distance fighter. There's going to be a level of people that think his punches land randomly, and oh, how did he do that? It's a random punch, because a lot of what he's doing to someone might be, oh, he's avoiding him, oh, he's not. And what I see is a guy who really understands his range, can set shots up with a jab, and can walk you into long punches because he can keep you at the end of his punch. His power comes at the end of his punches. But then he's also able to flurry and accumulate points. So what makes him dangerous to me is he's able to win in two styles. He can hurt you and chill you out, or he can throw volume, and he's got good fundamentals in footwork where he's a formidable force.
I also, to be honest, you know, that this was part of why I said the Catterall style is tough for Regis, because Regis only moves to the right. Catterall always had an out. There was very rare moments where Catterall's pinned on the ropes, because even if Regis is just throwing a double, triple jab, he's taking steps over to the right as he's doing it. He's not coming straight in, even against another lefty. So it gives a good mover, a smart guy like Catterall, an out, you know, on basically every exchange.
Yeah, completely. I was just going to seg off what Dakota was saying to kind of corroborate it. As someone who, prior to Taylor won, I was indifferent. I was just agnostic on Catterall. I didn't think positively or negatively about him. The aftermath and the years following that fight made me kind of view him antagonistically, where it's like, okay, you got robbed blind. It's a dirty business. We all know this. I think you have probably like 6 months to get it all out of your system, you know, use those tissues, like air your grievances. But at a certain point, it's like, let's get this career back underway. Let's start fighting again. And I thought his period of time following that robbery was far too long. And it probably lost a lot of public goodwill from folks who might have been sympathetic to him after that. So it's all in the past. I think he's back on the right trajectory now. And I think, just to reiterate what I was saying before, a lot of this now is not on Catterall. It's on Eddie to actually get him those fights that actually matter and raise his profile.
What's the Sam Jones role in this? I tried my hardest to not really. I know he's the manager of Catterall, but what was like his role during this week, and what were fans' relationship with the Regis Sam Jones issues?
It was very silly. It wound up just being kind of a meme. It had no real bearing on the fight. Sam Jones is the manager of Jack Catterall, and what kind of made Regis viral is during one of their pressers, he aired what appeared to be a voice note that you like send someone by text from before he was working with Catterall, where Sam Jones was saying like, yeah, I know Jack very well, but frankly, I just think you kick his ass and you beat him and all this good stuff toward Regis. And like Sam was swearing up and down. He never said that. So it was just like a kind of delicious little moment where someone is kind of caught in a 4K or whatever the kids say. So it was just like a fun little moment of receipts being pulled out. I don't think it really had much bearing on how the fight played out or anything. Maybe if anything, Catterall just kind of views him a little more skeptically going forward. Like, you know, you're saying these things about me and swearing otherwise. So, but at the end of the day, nothing changes. Sam Jones is going to continue being Catterall's manager. Yeah, he's a guy who says a lot of stuff. He doesn't have much of a filter. So
I once sat at a dinner table with him, and I think he talked for 95% of our meal at the Hacienda in Big Bear Lake, California.
Yeah, that tracks. If you follow him on Twitter, he just, yeah, like I said, he doesn't have a filter. He says a lot of stuff. So if you're ever a fighter who's of the mind to call him on that sort of thing, I'm sure it's actually like a fairly easy task. So it was just a funny little presser moment, but I don't think it had a lot of like long-term bearing on
I think
Sam.
that's a good thing to bring up, though, because there might be someone that saw a thing, didn't know. Plus, tell their buddy. As we go in, should we go into the big fights and then gradually go lower? Dakota, where do you want to start?
Well, I guess before we hop off this one, like what do we all want to see from Catterall next? Like I was thinking this through, and to me, it seems like the Liam Paro fight is the one that really makes sense. They're both, you know, Paro's coming off the Subriel Matias win. I know at one point Catterall was scheduled to fight Richardson Hitchens.
Bub, he's got a fight. Paro's fighting Hitchinson in Puerto Rico in December.
That's right. That's right. I forgot. That's a great fucking mess. So the winner of that, in theory.
Or, and then in the chat they're saying the voicemail was fake. Talking about avoiding guys. Well, here we go. Maybe Bang Bang Boogie gave us the answer. Love a little Bang Bang Boogie comment. What about Subriel Matias versus Catterall?
That's really interesting to me because I really want to see. Obviously, now we know that Catterall's style might be one that does bother Subriel Matias, but I'm also interested in seeing how Catterall reacts to somebody that's that much of a power puncher and that much of a foot pressure guy. Because most of the opponents he's had were not going to provide that thing. And I just think the winner of that would also be, you know, in the mix for the top. It also, a lot of what happens in this division right now, I think, hinges on what are Devin Haney and Teofimo Lopez going to do with their careers. Are their careers going to be, you know, fucked up by whatever else is going on outside of the ring? Or are they going to be active, dominant champions? And at the moment, it doesn't seem like that's what they're going to do. And so I think that guys like Catterall and Paro and Matias have an opportunity to like legitimately become the best guy in the division here.
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but I think even this question kind of hinges on Eddie Hearn. Jack Catterall is not a guy, clearly. I mean, this fight was in his backyard and very few people showed up. You're going to need to position him in the rankings to get him a title shot, to get him the big fights. No one's going to fight this guy of their own volition. He's got a really tricky style that's not very fan-friendly. So no one, if there's like a Subriel Matias out there, they're not going to be like, oh, I'll fight Jack Catterall just because why? He doesn't really bring anything of monetary value to you. So it's really incumbent on his promoter to position him in such a way where people have to fight him rather than want to. Before we move off this card entirely, I do have one other fight I wanted to pinpoint.
I want to get one last idea. Mm-hmm. Our guy, Mikewan Williams, he had a great knockout this past Wednesday that Dakota's looking at on a screen before. 3 knockouts this year. What about if Mikewan Williams got the opportunity of a lifetime in a number 1 contender type fight, if that were to happen against Jack Catterall in the UK?
That's so conflicting for me because on one hand, I think that Maikwan is ready to be in with the best of the best at 140. I also feel like Catterall has won a level of fight where he deserves to be in a fight for who the top guy is, and I'm not sure that that fight provides that. But if that fight was scheduled, I'd be very excited about it.
I just think that Milo hit on something important where those top guys aren't going to fight Catterall unless they can be compensated. So in that case, a guy like Maikwan Williams might be one of your better options to make a good fight because Maikwan's hungry and he's willing to take it. And in my eyes, he might be one of those top guys. He just might get the fight prematurely, kind of like Jamaine Ortiz got. And then we saw what class of fighter he was after those fights.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, at that show, I personally thought Mike stole the show. I've seen a lot of him on like the Northeast circuit. That was as sharp as I've seen Maikwan look in a long time. And I say that even knowing that he banked some rounds and it looks like he carried his opponent a little bit. Like he probably could have gotten an early KO and chose to get his feet wet, get acclimated to being back in the ring. But he looked very, very sharp. Lou and Eddie seem to have a kind of acrimonious relationships. They would have to be kind of big boys and sit down at the negotiating table to make that happen. But if it did, there'd be a hell of a fight. I wouldn't mind seeing that at all.
Okay, now back to your point you were going to make, Milo. I didn't want
of course. I was just going to highlight Pat McCormack. So two-time Olympian, won silver. He fought in a kind of forgettable fight versus this Argentinian guy named Williams Andres Herrera. So the fight itself is not what's noteworthy. It was kind of a one guy showed up to survive, and Pat looked kind of frustrated by it. But I think he's a 147 in an era where I think welter is a bit weaker than it has been in quite some time. Even despite Pat having some amateur tendencies and not really being the finished product at 29 by professional standards, he's a guy I could see getting some love from the WBA, because there was like a WBA regional title at stake. So it wouldn't shock me at all if, despite his kind of relative youth as a pro, he's only got 6 fights, if they maneuver him in such a way where he's fighting for a belt either in 2025 or early 2026. I took a look at the WBA rankings to see who they might position him in with, and I think 2 kind of slam dunk fights for him are either Gabriel Maestre, who's also in the WBA rankings, or Alberto Palmetta. And I highlight each of those just because they're each former Olympians. Pretty marketable fight. I mean, it wouldn't do like box office, but they're sensible fights, and they're ones that could prove to whoever oversees the WBA that this is a guy who is experienced well beyond his kind of early status as a pro. So yeah, maybe Palmetta would be a little more realistic as a kind of winnable fight for someone like Pat. But yeah, if Pat McCormack is not someone on your radar at 147, I would just keep an eye on him. He personally doesn't blow me away, but I think there are a lot of things going for him in this kind of lull period at 147 where he could be kind of accelerated up the rankings.
Yeah, he's always been a guy I've had high hopes for. He was one of the best Olympians in that 2020 class, and his career as a pro has kind of sucked. It's really not mattered.
Some of it his fault, some of it not. It makes me cringe a little bit that he's 29, and the reason he's been on the shelf this long is due to injuries, which I think is one thing when you're in your early 20s, but injuries get progressively more serious in your late 20s and such. So yeah, I think he knows the score. I think Eddie knows the score. The time to go is now. They've got to really
there's a skill set there, though, for sure. I mean, there's definitely a skill set. I think that's part of why he's still getting these kind of slots, is even if he is a little older, less experienced, inactive, injuries, whatever, there's something there.
Yeah, I think you're right, Dakota, and I'm not disagreeing. I think he's also one of these guys where this fight was a really good example of it, where you'll probably watch his fights and the commentators will be saying round after round, like, all right, is this where we see Pat really turn the screw and kind of get after it? And then it doesn't happen. Like this fight, which, my condolences if you sat through it. It was a really rough watch, but Herrera didn't really show up to fight. He showed up to play defense. He did his job. He survived all 10 rounds, but Pat got frustrated. And there were kind of moments I picked up on as a fan and viewer where it's like, when you're usually like touching gloves and going back to your corner, Pat is instead kind of like punching the other guy's glove, like, hey, come on, man, like, let's actually do something here. But the onus is on Pat to turn that around and kind of amp up the aggression. He just didn't really do it. So he might be one of these guys who, if he's ever in like a barn burner of a fight, it'll require the right dance partner.
Yep. Now let's go to just the DiBella card that you guys probably watched and is worth kind of noting. Real quick, just DiBella card notes. Dakota, do you want to take the lead or Milo?
I mean, I think because we were already talking about it, I think let's just expand a little bit about kind of the future for Mikewan Williams, because he's 26, but they mentioned that, like, I feel like I've been watching this guy for a while. I saw him live in person probably 4 or 5 years ago at the Edison Ballroom in the city. He was on an undercard, and I'm watching this guy like, this guy's not an undercard fighter. There's something here. But then there's also, you know, the Christian Guido performance. I think that was the guy's name, where there's a draw and then that guy gets destroyed by Tiger Johnson, and you're wondering, like, how does that compute? So I think that there's so many things to like about Mikewan, and sometimes you can just chalk that up to like off night, nobody's a machine, and also just turning pro really young has its, you know, its bumps in the road. But I think that he's a serious player at 140. I'm just surprised a guy that talented, 24 fights in, that he's not scheduled for 10 rounders at this point.
Yeah, I'm a fan. That's really all I can say is I like him. Some guys take time. Some guys take lumps and bumps. He can knock you out with short shots. He's got a good IQ. I like the way he shifts. I like his speed. I like that he's taken a fight against Luis Feliciano that a lot of people thought he'd lose, and he won and was dominant. I think he passes all the check marks, and he reminds me of a guy he sparred, Jamaine Ortiz, who fights this week. He kind of has a similar Northeastern vibe where it's like this guy that looks the part of something, but for some reason, whether it's politics, promotion, whatever, he hasn't quite gotten that opportunity. But I think he's going to be battle tested when he gets that spot.
Yeah, like I don't want to rag on promoters too much. It's kind of like all I do on Twitter, it seems, but like, the problem is, like, all right, well, in this world where politics and promotions issues are holding your career back, it's Lou DiBella's job to make those things kind of immaterial. So, you know, kind of what I was saying about names escaping me already, but like, Catterall. Yeah, it's like, the problem is that Mikewan Williams, he looks very, very good. He's just, the entity behind him needs to position him in such a way where he is in a major fight that's relevant in early 2025. You know, I was watching that fight live, and the matchup that came to mind for me, that the timelines align, is someone like Steve Claggett. Claggett got back in the ring. He was in a fight where he took very little damage. Claggett doesn't know how to have a boring fight. That would just be a guaranteed banger. I would have no hesitation if I'm Lou about sending Mikewan to Canada and having that fight, because I think personally Mikewan has what it takes to beat someone like Steve Claggett. And you know, if you're not one of the big boy promoters, you got to take chances like that sometimes. So yeah, if I'm Lou DiBella and I have an opportunity to send Mikewan into someone's backyard who has a big name and you can take that name, I wouldn't hesitate, because I think he's very, very good.
I also think, dude, you know, to be honest, it's like, he's just one of these guys. He's a main event fighter, bro. Like, he's got to be on the poster, even if it's for a pro box DiBella card of this caliber, of this level. He's got to be the main event guy to really start pushing him as a name. Like, look, smaller shows, but this is a headlining fighter right here. You know what I mean? On a certain level.
Yeah, and I also wanted to touch on Jerry Forrest, Earl Newman. That fight was weird. It felt like, to me, Earl Newman probably won, but Jerry Forrest won, but it felt like neither really can go beyond the level they're at. So it didn't really feel like either guy won, if that makes sense, because it feels like what they won was fights against like Jolioff and Richard Torres.
I thought that Jerry won the fight. I thought that some of the commentary was a little weird. There was long 30-second stretches where Jerry's putting work together and they're talking about, oh, there's no zip on his shots. Earl's so much sharper and this and that. And I'm watching the fight and I'm like, this is basically a 50-50 fight that I feel like Jerry's edging the rounds. So I feel like the commentary definitely had an impact on the, the narrative of the fight.
For me, the thing was, and maybe this is what happened to the commentators, I was seeing Earl's punches move Jerry's head back, and Jerry was throwing a lot of punches and very active, but his shots weren't having the same impact, though he was landing more volume. And I couldn't differentiate if those 2 or 3 power shots from Earl meant more than Jerry's lot of punches, but I couldn't tell how much damage they impacted.
For me, it was too far in between those moments for the most part, and I also just felt like, I love those guys as commentators, but I felt like they decided who won the fight in about the 5th round, and so what it was going to take for Jerry to win a round or to prove a point was going to be spectacular, and it wasn't a spectacular performance. It was just a good performance.
Any thoughts being there live, Milo?
Yeah, so I didn't have the luxury of hearing what like Chris and Paulie had to say on the fight. I watched it and I actually kept score, and I gave it to Jerry by a round. I'm very nostalgic toward Earl. I respect him a ton. Very good amateur who's had some breaks not go his way in the pros. These things happen. But he was in Team Combat League as a heavyweight, where I think most of his career has been at like light heavy and cruiser. And I actually thought he shaped up well as a heavyweight. Watching his Team Combat League run, I was like, yeah, I could see him being one of these guys who blows up into a heavyweight, but actually is productive. I watched it kind of cynically. Like anytime I'm watching a fight and I'm trying to score it and I'm favorable toward one guy, I'm trying to think in terms of like, how can a judge give rounds to the A side or the person who's meant to win? And watching that fight, I noticed just the uptick in volume, even if it's inconsequential. Like Jerry was throwing a lot of what I would call just like get off me jabs. They don't matter a whole lot, but it's like this guy outweighs me by like 40 pounds. So I'm just throwing these little pitter-patter jabs to keep him off him. I watched that fight thinking like it's unfortunate, but I bet that's going to get him through a lot of these rounds. And for his weight, I think is kind of noteworthy too. It was a career low. And I think it was strategic for this fight, but also maybe remnants of him getting stopped by Big Baby inside a round might have factored into that, where he's like, I have no future as a small tweener heavyweight at like 230. I've got to be even lighter and even more spry, which was helpful against Earl, but I don't know if that's going to help him against the Halalovs of the world. Like,
I mean, truth be told, I don't see what would be stopping him from dropping in 15 pounds and going to cruiserweight, where I think that his size and power could like really be more of a factor in that division. And obviously, 36 years old, you're at least on the back 9, right? Like to me, at least, it's not that big of a stretch to see him drop down and fight Zordo or fight, the winner of Zordo and Billiam Smith, or, someone more in that size, where he's not fighting guys that are 30, 40, 50 pounds heavier than him.
I think the only thing stopping him is this right there. He's a guy who, to his name, he can say he lost a disputed decision against, or was it a draw with Zhilei Zhang? He's fought the creme de la creme at heavyweight. I couldn't imagine the money would be comparable if he were to drop down to cruiser. And he's a guy at the age and with the mileage that he has, right? Don't think he has the luxury of being like, let me put together 3 or 4 fights at cruiser and then see what happens. Like, he's got to have a big money fight happen.
I just think of a guy like Mike Perez a few years ago, who was a heavyweight of a certain caliber, but his drop down to cruiserweight. And even if it's not, this run that's getting a lot of attention, he's essentially, I think, undefeated in the last, 5 years or so, and has kind of reinvented, what the end of his career is going to look like.
I don't disagree with you. I think stylistically, and if, professional accomplishments are all that matter to you, then you're right.
That's the big one.
I think financially that factors in a lot, because it's like, what are you going to do? Are you going to fight F.A. Apoche or Brandon Glanton for probably like a third of the money you would get to fight, I don't know, Huey Fury or someone like that? Like, I just don't see it happening, but I would welcome it. like, I think you're right. Professionally, it probably makes a lot of sense for him.
So let's go main event now. What did you guys think of Yoshida Metcalf?
Terrible ass scorecards, I thought. Like, I don't know if I'm, kind of on one here, but I thought there was only one winner there. But, it's kind of like I said on Twitter after the fight. So I've been a kind of defender of the 2-minute round system for women fights. I think there are a lot of positives to it. I think it's fighting in its most pure sense as opposed to 3-minute rounds at times. I go back again to like the Mare versus Sandy Ryan fight. I don't think that fight would have been the classic it was if not for this frenetic pace where you must win every round. And that's 2-minute rounds at its best. And then 2-minute rounds at its worst is something like Yoshida Metcalf, where I truly think judges are watching a lot of shit happen in not a lot of time, and they're just guessing. And that's how you get scorecards like 99-91 Metcalf, which is just like...
That was wild, bro, because it's a close fight to me either way, but to have it 9-1, to me...
I mean, the fans that didn't watch the fight and that judge both can say the same thing. They didn't see the fight.
Yeah, it just seemed like when Yoshida was able to close distance, particularly in the back half of rounds for the most part, it seemed like she's the one landing the bigger, more eye-catching shots. Metcalf had stretches of control in the range and landing some stuff on the outside, but it just, in the who would I rather be, it felt like I would have slightly rather have been Yoshida. I think a draw would have been appropriate, but 9-1 for Metcalf was wild to me.
It felt very drawish to me. It felt like Metcalf did all of her work in the first half, and Yoshida really came on in the end of rounds. And I was really surprised that like a 9-1 card got scored, because normally the judges score the person that goes forward, if we're being honest. And this was an instant where the fighter who was moving around, who was, I guess you could say, boxing, but Metcalf has like a strange boxing style. It's not your most quote unquote fundamental boxing style, but she was moving back, moving forward. They scored more for a boxing style than a pure aggression style, which is, I feel like, kind of not typical. And I found this fight very hard to discern a winner. I felt like there were a lot of 49-51 rounds.
Yeah. I have no further thoughts on the fight. I kind of gave my like little synopsis. I just think I'll preface it by saying, I watch a lot of women's boxing. I know there's very little money to be made. I'm genuinely happy that Metcalf is going to get a bag from this fight. There are fights for her to be made. And just having said that, like, I'm not looking forward to seeing her again. She's a really rough watch, I think. I think it's one thing to be gangly and kind of unorthodox in your approach, but there are stretches of her fights where it looks like she doesn't really know how to fight, frankly. Like, doesn't make use of her length, of her natural God-given ability frame over someone like Yoshida, who's shorter and stocky and just kind of trudges forward.
Which is like, she knows how to use it, but gives it up in those weird spots where it's like, what are you doing getting hit with
and then
that?
She doesn't punch at the end of range. So she'll give up the range because she's not punching, or she'll get too aggressive and then she falls in with her punches. It was strange. And then at times it felt like I wanted her to sit down a little lower so she could really dig into the ground and pop the jab and be more precise with the shots. And I know people will be like, well, isn't that the coach's job? When you have a 39-year-old fighter, it's hard to really reinvent that person. That's who they are. So, I mean, this is a finished product, basically, and you have to just kind of work with what you got. So, I mean, when you get to these type of fighters, I don't really think you can really add. You just have to refine what you got.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Lukey, because it kind of dovetails with my macro just thoughts on who Metcalf is and why I'm kind of not dying to see her again. I think I wouldn't be so harsh if this is a younger fighter with this style, but it's just like, fuck me. We've got a champion who's 39, not going to improve, and is already like such a brutal watch, in my opinion. So again, like, I genuinely want her to make her money, and I want her boxing journey to be worthwhile financially, where she can live comfortably. It's just that as a fan, I can't lie and say like, oh, cool, Metcalf is champ and I get to watch her again 2 or 3 more times on national TV. It's just not really it's not really for me personally.
Quick hit fan questions. We should get Matias versus Catterall next for the winner of Hitchinson Paro. Makes sense. Great fights. Who's better, McCormick, Patty Donovan, or Luis Crocker? I'm going to say Patty Donovan. Panel, what do you think?
I think I would go with Patty Donovan as well. He's just kind of stuck out a little more for me. I think there's a little bit more wow factor. Maybe that's what I'm looking for.
Definitely not Donovan for me. I would do it a tie between like McCormack and Crocker. That actually wouldn't be half a bad fight. I'm not sure if Crocker's still represented by Matchroom, but if it made sense for each party, I could see that being a fight. I think it's kind of a toss-up between those two. I'm personally just like everything I've seen from Patty Donovan. I'm not terribly high on him personally.
The IBF ordered Hitchens and Catterall earlier this year. Matchroom didn't make the fight because it was expected to be a boring fight. Catterall is ranked number 3. Sabril is number 5 with the IBF. What's the problem with Eddie Hearn giving Matisse a rematch or the winner of Paro Hitchens? Been watching Catterall since his pro debut, thinks he's a great fighter, and personally, I think he will go on to win a world title. Great takes. Oshaki, Foster, Robson, Conceicao. What are we thinking, guys?
I mean, listen, bro, if it's anything like the first one, it should be, and there's just different judges watching the fight, should be a very easy fight for Shock. You know, Paulie made a great point at one point during the commentary on this last fight. He was like, sometimes when a fighter gets ripped off and that is a decision and they feel like they won, they try to change too many things because they're worried, like, well, if they're not going to give it to me when I do that, I got to do this. And sometimes it's just as simple as just keep doing what you're doing. And hopefully for Shock, you know, that's kind of been the goal, is to keep doing what you're doing and maybe put a little more of a stamp on some of the rounds, or don't let it go 12, but don't completely change who you are as a fighter because you got a bad decision.
Yeah, I don't really know what to make of that one. I'm personally not the Shock guy, like, of this panel, I'm assuming. I just don't know if he knows how to put a stamp. Maybe it's a father time thing on some of these fights. So he's got these fights versus Miguel Roman, Yakubov, Ray Vargas, comfortable wins. And his last stretch of fights are just like very, very close.
The Yabanov fight was close. It's closer than people remember. Okay. Because that was on remember Probellum? That was on probellum.com.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Who bankrolled those people, by the way? Anyway. But yeah. Excuse me. The Rocky Hernandez fight got the stoppage, but it was down on one card.
On all the cards, right?
99, 110. Yeah. Well, one of them he was ahead on.
But I think we can, me and Dakota would push back and say that was kind of a one where we were seeing that as a close fight, and that was kind of some favorable scoring, in my opinion.
It was favorable scoring. Location certainly mattered. I think it was just a matter of he has these fights where even if someone is landing less aggressive, less effective punches, but they are the aggressor, as Rocky was in that fight, it just leaves a bit more room for subjectivity than I would like in scoring. And I think the Nova fight was incredibly close too. I think Nova could have won that fight. Real shame that Abraham got dropped the way he did in the last round, because otherwise I thought that was another kind of toss-up. So I think the public perception that this is just one that Shock gets right and he writes this wrong is perhaps misguided. I think this is another close fight, and yeah, it's kind of a toss-up to me.
I'm gonna actually double down on what you're saying, and I'm a Shock guy, and Dakota will probably love to hear this. I did a story with Bobby, the trainer, Bobby Benton, and he said just what you said. He said if we had competent judges, we win that night. Like, Shock doesn't have to do a thing. And when I heard that, I'm like, okay, that's a great coach. That's a good leadership role, because like you said, I think people's first inclination when they lose is, we saw it with what's his name, Big Shot Shaw. Like, he's doing all these great things, and we see his adjustment was, I'm going to take more shots and be offensive. And that wasn't what brought us to the party that got us so excited about him. So sometimes guys take a loss and they read things and make an interpretation, and it's not what we think. Not what we think. It's not what's going to benefit them in their career. But then sometimes they do, and it's great. I think Conceicao deeply feels wronged and he deeply feels he's being overlooked. And I think that it's very dangerous being in this position because he comes in as the champion with confidence, having a very serious camp at Top Rank. And he had a ton of motivation to be like, all these guys are saying I shouldn't have won. And I think he's the ultimate chip on the shoulder guy. Minor details. He's also an Olympic gold medalist. They don't just give that to you because you're a nice guy. Conceicao always in friggin' shape, bro. He throws a ton of punches. To me, this is a fight where I think people are going to be surprised that Robson is going to treat it like a professional, though me and Dakota will always say the guy's a constant professional. He's like one of the guys in this era that always fights. But I would favor Shock in this fight because I think he's a generational type fighter. He's, in my opinion, almost a perfect fighter, except times the volume. But this is going to be a real fight because Conceicao has that technical style, but it's mixed with an element of fighting. And I think the hidden formula to Conceicao is he punches harder than it looks. So I think he leverages those shots that are slappy. They kind of hit harder.
One thing I would note too about Robson, he's a guy who blows weirdly hot and cold in his performances. Like those who remember, he I don't know if robbery is an appropriate descriptor
against
but
King Louis.
King Louis, yeah, that was a terrible performance. But then, to his credit, he bounces back against someone who I think is very skilled in Xavier Martinez and has like a phenomenal performance. So what if it's just the case that we got like bad Robson last time, and this time he shows up more fit and ready for the 12 rounds? Like all things considered, I just have a hard time overlooking him in this one.
Can I also add something? If I'm not mistaken, wasn't he coming off of, like, he might have had a cup of coffee in the ring, but he was coming off a very grueling Navarrete fight.
I was going to say that too. I think that fight actually took something out of maybe more than Navarrete actually than Conceicao, but Conceicao did take a lot of punishment in that fight. He's a guy in his 30s. You know, I'm not overlooking him at all. There's a very good chance that he could win or at a minimum be highly competitive in this fight, you know, but honestly, to add to what Milo was saying, Shock has had a lot of close fights, and that wasn't one of them. And so at this point, ironically, it being a loss, it's probably the widest fight that he's had in this championship stretch.
It was such a dominant performance, Dakota, that I started doing other stuff.
Yeah.
That's how dominant it was. I started doing other activities. I think I was vacuuming because it was such a foregone conclusion that Shock was going to win.
Yeah. And honestly, too, live, you know, sitting at press row for his fight with Nova, also sitting with our friend Jack Kelly, who's like kind of in the Nova camp and had some
the legend
had some personal attachment in that fight. Everybody at press row either had it 8-4 or 9-3 for Shock because, and like you know how it is when you get up in person. There was something about his power where even though the lack of activity at times makes the rounds, I think, disputable, which is always going to be his issue, when he lands, it's serious.
Can I make a headline for the aggregators? Only for the aggregators, okay? Shock Foster reminds me of Terrence Crawford in his low volume but ability to hit really hard and change fights.
I think that characteristic is similar. There is also times where, you know, he does kind of remind me of Maiquan, where he's really sharp and accurate with how he lands. He's sharp defensively. He's just a little bit more of a back foot kind of guy. And I think though he shouldn't need to because of how dominant the first one was, I think that he's going to take that as like, nah, I got to go hurt this guy. And that may or may not work for him. That may open some shit up for Robson as well.
Okay, I think my only thoughts on that fight is watching it from home, listening to the Top Rank broadcast, which I think is like Timmy and what's his face, the guy next to me,
Joe Tessitore.
There you go. Yeah. Frankly, I don't think they did a great job. I mentioned kind of when we were talking about Forrest versus Newman. If I'm scoring a fight, I'm trying to really see all angles, and frankly, like, there's probably a better way to phrase it, but I'm trying to think of a way that a bad judge might shade rounds in a certain direction. And I think to their detriment, they didn't really do that. And that kind of sparked a lot of outrage. because there were a lot of rounds where it's like 75% shock and then 25% Robson doing some kind of noteworthy work, and that was kind of glossed over. And that's not to say those were good cards, because they weren't. Shock won that fight in, you know, probably all of our minds. But yeah, I think they didn't. If you're a broadcaster and your job is to kind of inform the public, I don't think they did a great job of it. It's one thing for a fan to be like, yeah, this is shock easy, shutout, whatever. But I think if you're a broadcaster, you kind of, the onus is on you to be like, yeah, he's winning these rounds, but there's some room for subjectivity in some of these, where if you're, you know, a judge looking to give us to Robson for whatever reason, you kind of have the ability to do so.
The gold standard is the Steve Weisfeld scorecard for Chris Algieri versus Ruslan Provodnikov. That was like 10-2 Ruslan, and then Chris won a split decision. That's like the gold standard of just completely letting the viewer be clueless. Like, you're taking them on a journey that's not really what they're seeing, bro.
And wasn't that how Letterman scored it as well? If I recall,
no,
correct?
I think Weisfeld was the scorer for that night, and not Letterman.
I don't know. I remember Harold having it real wide for Ruslan. Maybe I'm misremembering that.
Yeah, but anyways, let's run through these undercard things, and we'll talk a little Kid Austin, but there's not really a super notable. We got on the undercard, I'm just going to throw them out there, and then people are going to respond. We got Ranger Danger. I said Ranger Danger. We got Raymond Danger Muratalla versus Jesus Ricky Perez. Pretty good fight for those unaware. Danger Muratalla is obviously a really good fighter. He's having trouble going from good to great. He's kind of stuck in that limbo. He's not able to jump up to force a fight with a guy like Keyshawn Davis, per se. He's kind of in this limbo of, we all know he's good. That Tevin Farmer fight really felt like he was trying to make a statement to get a Shakur fight, because it feels like every promoter's bringing Tevin in to assess how you do with Shakur. We also have one of the legend Jack Kelly's friends, Mike Ohan Jr., taking on Bryce Mills. I think that could be a real fight, because Bryce Mills, local ticket seller in Verona, doesn't have an affiliation, I believe, with Top Rank. Ohan, decorated guy. He got stopped by Abdullah Mason. He got stopped by Tiger Johnson, but he's a solid guy. So we don't know where Mills stacks up. I like both of those guys. We got Abraham Nova against Humberto Galindo. I think sneaky good fight, because that's a Raymond Muratalla. He knocked down Muratalla in Fresno, but then Muratalla came back and stopped him. That's going to be at 130 pounds. And then I have two other fights that I listed noteworthy. And of course, you guys will probably... Actually, no, I've got every fight except for the Kanibe fight is notable to me. Jahai Tucker versus...
That was my notable fight.
Well, let me throw to you right now.
Yeah, that fight's kind of hilarious. I think for the diehards, that'll be one to keep tabs on. I'm frankly a little surprised someone like Richard Lardy is getting sanctioned in America. If you've watched some of his defeats, it kind of looks like he brings his scuba gear to the ring. And I think that's gotten him kind of exiled from the UK, where he's had some of these fights. So if Neba lands just right, or in such a way where it could look like a devastating shot, it wouldn't surprise me to see Lardy kind of look like he's been shot and kind of collapse to the canvas. So that one's kind of interesting. I'm a little surprised Lardy is fighting in the US, where they seem to have kind of higher standards.
So that's a meme factor fight, maybe?
Yeah, exactly.
A meme factor fight.
Exactly,
okay.
Yeah.
What other? Because I like the Kilo the Kid Jahai Tucker fight. Kilo the Kid lost to Amari Jones. He was at one point signed to Top Rank. He's on a losing streak, but he's a tough physical guy. Jahai was once a welterweight. Now he's a middleweight, and he only fights real guys. Even like his soft touches are against real guys. Like, Jahai just fights. Every fight he's in is a real fight. Like, guys that beat him are now considered prospects, and he was fighting them as first fight of the night. Nicholas Flaws, he fights him first night. Now he's considered a guy. Like, that's Jahai's career. Ali Feliz is taking on Rashad Coulter, Milo, Dakota. I think there's a possible upset here. I don't love Ali Feliz's defense. I love him as a person. I don't love a heavyweight that's doing a lot of catch counter and reflex-based stuff. That kind of scares me. And Jan Santana, I don't know a thing about him, but he's in with Eduardo Baez in a 10-round fight. That means he's going to be doing something meaningful soon. So you might as well tune in and figure out who the freak that guy is. Guys, who wants to start and kind of say what they're excited about?
Dakota, you can go ahead.
Well, I think that there's a couple interesting things here. I think for one, Murataya is fighting this guy Campos, who I know just beat Jojo Diaz. It's so tough to gauge what Jojo is bringing to the table at this point, but that is an impressive win to have on your record. I just felt like, the way that Ray fought Farmer, it was a tough fight for him, but he really closed the show strong and showed some versatility. I sort of thought he was on a certain trajectory where he's still not like you said, Lukey, he's not getting the Keyshawn Davises. He's not getting some of these bigger names at lightweight. And so he's continuing to have fights at this sort of fringe contender, bottom of the top 20 level where, it's good to see him active and everything. I'm just not sure if those are the matchups that are going to get people's attention and move him forward.
Yeah, with Muratalla, I don't know. I think he's a fantastic fighter. I love fighters that are a gentleman, that aren't doing trash talk, that aren't beating people up outside of the ring, that are staying in the gym. It seems like he's always at Robert's gym. They speak highly of him. If this was a real sport, he'd get an opportunity, but I think there is a little bit of, like you say, Dakota, there's a character-based element to these fighters, and a guy like Muratalla is more of just a professional guy who's good. And he's kind of sitting in that dangerous spot where it's like, how do you stay motivated when you're on fight number 4, where if you look good, you might get a better fight?
Well, and how do you stay motivated when Tank Davis is taking fights with guys that aren't in his weight class? Shakur seems to be having hand issues and is just on the shelf for now. And Lomachenko, it's come out that he's like thinking about retiring. So the 3 big names at your weight class, like at 140 at the moment, are just not really active, involved members of the weight class. And so it's guys like Murataya and William Zepeda that are going to have to fight each other and kind of figure out who the actual top guy is.
And I want to add to that, Baranchek is also a champion. And I feel like Dennis Baranchek, if Keyshawn Davis were to beat Gustavo Lamos, which I think is a tough fight, by the way, guys. I don't think that's a gimme fight. I think that might set the stage for that fight next year. I think Keyshawn's at that point where they'd probably ramp him into a title. So that's another probably thing where he wouldn't be the guy fighting the vulnerable champion, I don't think either.
I think I would just push back on the idea maybe that like Murataya is more or less a victim of circumstance. I personally think he has questions to answer after the Zolani and Dongani fight. That was very close. And his subsequent performance against Farmer, who I know is tricky, but getting on in years, didn't do much to kind of assuage those concerns. Like, and Dongani was coming off getting stopped by Arnold Barboza, which like I didn't know that was allowed. And he gives Murataya, all he can handle for 10 rounds. So
looks like the Wasp. He lived up to his nickname in that fight.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he's had some really impressive performances. I thought Nakatil would give him a much tougher fight than he wound up giving. So fair play. I'm generally not the biggest Raymond Murataya guy, but if he is to become a player in this division, I think he's got to do something real impressive against Ricky Perez.
Is there a world where Ricky Perez gives him a really hard fight?
1,000%.
I think it probably is a style. It's a good fight for Murataya, but this is also a guy with some momentum behind him. And he may have watched that Farmer fight and went, maybe this guy's not all that. And so he's got, a mentality that's going to help him. I just think what I like the most about Murataya is the ability to adjust. And even if, the first half of the fight with Farmer is close and Farmer gets 3-4 rounds on him, ultimately by the end of the fight, he's the one pushing Farmer back and making him uncomfortable. And so he's shown an adaptability that I think is sometimes not a tangible trait that you can put on a stat sheet or on a punch stat, but it is a talent.
So I want to also throw one thing, and then we'll go through more of these that interest you guys. I think that inconsistent fighters in their development, we fall in love with the inconsistencies. But some guys like Kell Brook and stuff, they had up and down performances, and then they get it and they go to a champion level. I'm not sure where he stacks, but I think that it's not. I think that he's a guy, to me, we're looking for consistency from him, because we've seen some great performances. When he fought last November in Tahoe, that was a great performance against a puncher. Then he fights the Wasp, and he really didn't look good. Tevin, to me, is a really high-level fighter, so I'm not going to really look down on that one, because Tevin does some really great things in there. Any others, Dakota, Milo, that you guys are looking at, chomping at the bits?
Just to respond to the Tevin thing, like, I don't disagree. Like, he's very good, but I think after we see what Zepeda is going to do to him, that'll be a tougher sell for Top Rank to say, like, well, listen, Tevin Farmer is a world-class fighter. I think William Zepeda is going to run right through him. And if that happens, then, like, that narrow win kind of ages like milk a little bit. So, I don't know. As far as, like, other things to bounce off, I'm really into the Eduardo Baez fight. That's a really good test. Baez is one of my favorite fighters. Certainly the mileage is accruing. He's not the fighter he was a few years ago, but he will reliably bring it. He's a very, very tough fighter and very skilled. So that's one I've personally got some interest in watching play out.
Yeah, I know very little about Jan Santana, so I will know more about him after Saturday. Dakota, any fights on this undercard that you like?
Always love me some Jahai Tucker, bro.
Always love. What is it? No tickets on Instagram now, or big tickets? What's his thing?
I don't know. I don't know that I've seen.
He's got a hashtag, something tickets.
I like that.
I like it too, man. I like when a young fighter's got a little hashtag that they're going.
That's the thing about Jahai, bro. He's just kind of he's like a good hang. Like when I had him on Slip and Weave, it was like half of the show was him telling me what kind of anime and music he liked, and like playing with rubber bands and shit. Like he's just like, he's an out there kind of guy, but he really believes in what he does and he believes in himself. And so he takes matchups where it's like, fucking take it easy, bro. But he shows up. He really does.
Yeah, I actually wasn't the hugest Jahai Tucker fan until he fought what's his face, the Georgian fighter, where he got staggered real bad in round one.
The experiment, the guy that Peter Kahn had, Nikolai.
Yeah, that was some big boy shit. That was really cool. He overcame some real adversity and then wound up kind of clowning that dude by the end. So that was a real cool fight. My only other thing on Jahai Tucker, it might be my bias showing now that I'm kind of like a newfound like fanboy of him. I know Top Rank is trying to do this thing of like building Xander Zayas versus Vito Milnicki. I think if Jahai still has it in him to boil down to 54, I'd far prefer seeing that fight.
He doesn't though, bro. Unfortunately, like, he really doesn't. Sad. It sucks, but I don't think he can make 154 anymore. He just, when you go pro at 17, you forget, like, some of these guys keep growing until they're 23, 24 years old. And I just think that he's still kind of having
bold Lukey proclamation. Jahai Tucker will take a heavyweight fight before it's all said and done.
Wow, that's wild.
What do you think, Dakota? What would you set the money line on that? Plus or
I don't think he'll take a heavyweight fight, but I think he'll take a light heavyweight fight before it's all said and done.
Milo, do you think he takes a heavyweight fight?
You're giving the aggregators a field day. It's going to be like multi-headline, like
boxing writer.
Lukey Boxing, Shock Foster is the next Terrence Crawford, and also Jahai Tucker is a problem at heavyweight.
Jahai Tucker versus Anthony Joshua next.
Book it.
Yeah, no, they just write boxing writer. Boxing writer says. Yeah, let's just go over. Floyd Schofield has a fight. It's against Rene Tellez Giron. You might know him because he knocked out Carlos Balderos 5 years ago. Then he was signed to Top Rank and really did nothing with that opportunity and beat George Acosta. Now Kid Austin is back. He had a really weird fight earlier this year. I'm struggling to be enthused about this fight, but I'm really trying. Guys, what are you thinking?
I'm still in kind of like the show me phase with Floyd Schofield. I don't really know what to make of him. Extremely weird fight last time out. A guy like hell-bent on DQing himself. Just looking at his CV and kind of remembering what I've seen of him, I don't really know if there's enough to draw a firm conclusion. Giron's a real guy. His losses are ones that you can kind of defend. Like Jose Matias Romero is a good fighter. So yeah, I think this is hopefully just like a solid bookend to 2024. Then Q1 next year, he's in a tougher fight because right now I just don't really know what to make of him.
Dakota, we know we can punch, but besides punching, do we think that Rene Tellez Giron is a guy that will punch with you? He's a sturdy object, a sturdy man. He's going to plant his feet and punch with you. He's crazy. He's a little dirty. He's probably taking notes on that guy, giving him a DQ. One thing, here's a betting thing, right? Schofield's been cut in a fight. He got cut against Haskell Rhodes. A guy like this, this is a guy who's physical and tough. A cut could surface. Dakota, looking at this, what are you seeing, bro? You normally see the world fairly accurately.
Well, I appreciate that, bro. I mean, I think that Giron is the type of fight you want to see Floyd in at this point. Like it's a genuine fringe contender who, unless you're, a top 5 guy, he's going to beat you. And, it's one of those things where this just feels like, part of the progression.
Yeah.
But I also agree with Milo in the sense that there is like I'm not too sure where Schofield is at. The eye test says, I like what I see, but the rest of it is a little unclear.
Missing that quintessential step-up fight. It's a shame we didn't get the Ashton Silva fight because that was like the perfect fight for both of them at that moment to see. And then Silva got knocked out. So now we'll probably never see that fight or not in the same capacity. Looking over the undercard of this fight, we've got a lot of fights I'm not super interested in. So we got Beck the Bully versus David Stevens. You might remember David Stevens was knocked out by me and Dakota's friend, Joe Sean James, in 1 round. I don't really see how this fight goes any different. I like David Stevens. He's been a guest on the show. But Beck the Bully is just a guy that you don't want to fight if you've been stopped in 1 round. Like, I feel like that's not the style. Darius Fulgham is taking on a veteran, Chris Pearson. Fulgham, I like him. I think he's got to add a little bit to his game. Pearson's an older guy. If this fight gets close, it wouldn't shock me. Gabriela Fendora versus Gabriel Aliens. I'm sure I'm going to confuse the two at some point. That's going to be annoying. That's the best fight on the card. That's for the flyweight undisputed title. That's a real fight. And then we got Joel Irarte versus not a local, but a regional tough veteran in Xavier Madrid. And then a sneaky good fight with Eric Tudor against Harold Calderon, who has a really built up record, but only has taken like 1 substantial fight in his whole career.
Yeah, I don't mind this card at all. I think there's some interesting fights. Like you said, Lukey, the Balinese fight kind of has high potential to steal the show. Incredibly tough fighter, Lachucky, coming off what should have been 2 wins over Marlon Esparza. I think her initial loss, the cards were so controversial that it sort of forced the sanctioning body to order a rematch, and that's when she got her rightful win. And as good as she is, I'm holding out hope that Fundora can continue kind of staking her claim as someone who's not just winning fights on, her God-given frame and freakishly long length, because she's a hell of a fighter. So if she can put a beat down on someone like Alanis, who we know is a world-class fighter, I think that would be sick, and I would be here for it. Just on the Stevens note, I'm a big-time RIP Showbox guy. I really miss their programming, and Stevens gave, I think, us like one of the preeminent Showbox moments with his buzzer beater KO over this guy. I hate that his name's escaping me because he's a New Orleans fighter. But
it's not Jeremy Hill. It was David Stevens versus Sean Hemphill.
There you go. And Hemphill's a good fighter too. And that was a thrilling fight. So I've got some time for Stevens for that. I guess the only other thing I've got is like the Fulgham matchmaking. I don't want to be too harsh. It gives me scared matchmaking vibes. I'm not terribly high on Fulgham. He's in a position where he could still improve, but he's 28. And especially on the heels of a win over someone like Vaughn Alexander, I don't know what another workman-like performance over Christopher Pearson does for him. So yeah, I do kind of wonder if Golden Boy matchmakers are a little skeptical of him and his ceiling.
Dakota.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I haven't seen too much of Fulgham, but what I have seen, I liked. So whenever that's the case, I mean, and Christopher Pearson has been a relatively tricky guy, but I don't know enough about his progression, I guess.
I mean,
well, he had a sorry, go ahead, Lukey.
No. You're gonna be more qualified, so just go for it.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but he had that fight against Trevor McCumbee on Pro Box, and I think in real time it didn't look great because he looked a little over the hill and wasn't reacting so great to punches. But then we just saw McCumbee give Caleb Plant all he can handle, so maybe we've got to reassess how much Pearson has left in the tank. But yeah, I don't know. I think if you have any stock in Fulgham, and if he is to be anything at 168, this has got to be like a statement performance. I don't think a 97-93 sort of fight does a whole lot for him, to be honest.
And only one last thing to bring up. Jamaine Ortiz returns on DAZN this weekend. I looked at the opponent, don't know a ton about his opponent. Once again, these MVP most valuable promotions prospect cards are really fun. There's always at least one good fight on them. I really recommend people check them out. But Jamaine Ortiz, I think, has entered the realm of, hey, he's fighting, you should watch.
Which I think is unfortunate because I thought it was not dominant, but I thought it was relatively clear that he had beaten Teofimo Lopez. We've talked about, Teofimo's been the beneficiary of scoring and boxing politics, and Jamaine Ortiz hasn't so far. And where I think, particularly at 140, where there's a lot of really interesting fighters, interesting matchups, and style contrasts to be made, I'd like to see him in the mix of that. I think that Jamaine Ortiz and Myquan Williams is a fantastic fight, but unfortunately,
albeit they were sparring partners. So, but maybe that makes a better fight for New England.
Yeah, I think that especially because New England boxing fans are so passionate, I think that that's a fight that makes a lot of sense. Again, like you said, Lukey, I don't really know much about the opponent, but what I do know is that when Jamaine Ortiz has had his biggest fights, he's shown up. He didn't beat Lomachenko, but I thought it was pretty clear that he beat Lopez. And it sucks that you go to the back of the line off of a performance like that.
And then I just want to also say, as a fan of boxing, when guys show up and give performances, I think it's important as fans to show up when they have to do these rebuilds to kind of give them that support that this is a sport. When a guy like Jamaine Ortiz is fighting, not to say it's a smaller show, but he's a main event fighter and he is main eventing this show. But this feels like get a win and then see if a big opportunity happens. And I think it's important for fans, if you like that performance or you thought he showed up for you, to really go with the fighter and watch that fight, because that's how the fighter can actually have a little power in this situation.
Totally agreed. I don't know much about Jamaine's opponent, but yeah, he's a guy who's kind of hard not to like. So hopefully he gets through that fight unscathed, and then we see him right back in the driver's seat. He's obviously more befitting of these kind of Teofimo Lopez sort of matchups rather than, fighting on a weeknight in Orlando. So hopefully he makes hay out of this.
Yep. Okay, guys, that was the show this week. Why don't you guys both sell the general public on why they should follow all your enterprises and boxing endeavors?
You can always follow me on Instagram and YouTube at the Slip and Weave Podcast. You can catch me on the Lukey Boxing Show and ITR Boxing. And nice to meet you, Milo. Great to have you on the show today as a co-commentator. And
good hang, right? Good hang.
Solid hang. Comment section's been popping, even if it's been a little kooky. We're always glad you guys are here.
Hey, thanks for the salute from Puerto Rico. I need to go there. So
Absolutely.
Thank you. You're helping me get there. And Milo, where can people... I know you have a great iTunes podcast that I'm a subscriber to. Dakota's sucking on his thumb in the lead up to this. That was a little thumb sucking, but
it was an index finger, and I had
a thumb suck. Rewind the tape. It's a Bruder film. Milo, where can people go and support your takes? Because I think you obviously showed that for hardcore boxing fans, they need to consume your content, however you put it out, because it's interesting around boxing.
Well, that'll be tough to live up to. I don't know. First of all, thanks, Lukey, for having me on. Dakota, real nice to meet you as well. It's Pod and Weave. Like I said, it's a boxing betting centric show, but we kind of touch on everything in the world of boxing. So Pod and Weave, Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, you can find us on there. Before we hop off, I've got 2 fights real quick to highlight for the weekend.
I love this. I love this. Look at this. We're doing our out calls. He's like, let me give you 2 deep dives.
Yeah, I would regret it if I didn't. So, all right, Saturday, real quick. Liam Davies against Shabazz Massoud. Not because I think this fight's going to be all that great. Like, I think Davies is going to wipe him out. But Liam Davies is someone who should be on your radar. He's on a hellacious run at Super Bantam. So if he continues in the form that he's been fighting in and gets Massoud out of there, which I think is pretty live, he will be a player in 2025 for world titles, certainly. And then also kind of looking ahead to the following week, Azeez Iglesias versus Petro Ivanov on an Eye of the Tiger show.
Oh, that's our guy.
That is a can't miss fight. I don't see a way that fight isn't complete fireworks. So yeah, it's a ways ahead, but I think it'll be on like ESPN Plus probably. A lot of the Eye of the Tiger shows are. Yeah, figure out a way to watch that fight. Azeez Iglesias versus Petro Ivanov. I'm a big Ivanov fan. I think that's a proper fight at 168. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled for those 2. And again, guys, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
We prematurely say Iglesias might beat David Morrell and David Benavidez and regret it. Like in when he has his first hard fight, like they had a hard fight and then we all of a sudden jump to conclusions. But can we jump on that train of just irrationally overrating him?
Can I go even more irrationally and say if Ivanov wins that fight, then he becomes that guy who wins those fights? Like, yeah, go on YouTube if you've not seen Petro Ivanov. He's a damn good fighter. So I'm not convinced at all that this is a cakewalk for Iglesias.
Well, I'm so high on him is because Eddie Croft's my friend, and he trained Evgeny Shevchenko, and that's a very, very good fighter, right? And what he did to Evgeny was not just scary, but it's like that's a very good fighter that he made look like a tune-up fight. And that is really, really impressive.
See, it is, and I hate being in this position to like denigrate wins or something, but it is a fight where he caught him with like a perfect temple shot inside the first round. And I would have loved as a fan to have seen that go a few more rounds and see how he navigates someone like that. But it's not his fault that he got an early stoppage, so you can't really begrudge him for that. I think, you know, if Ivanov clears the first couple of rounds, because that's been the bugaboo of most of these Azeez Iglesias opponents, then this is a very real fight and a test where we get a more vivid picture of like who he is.
Dakota, do you want to make any statements, or shall you rest in peace?
I really like Iglesias. I haven't seen the opponent Petro, but I'll definitely make
sure.
Come
on, bro. Try to pronounce the last name. The viewers want to hear it.
Ivanov. You know me with the names, bro. I sounded out till I got it. You know what I'm saying? But I haven't gotten to see Ivanov. But everything I've seen from Iglesias, again, somewhat eye test, but there is legitimate opposition there that could lead you to believe that, yeah, maybe he's not beaten the Davids yet, but he maybe has a seat at the table and should be in those conversations.
I agree. Okay, that's the end of the show. We will be back next week. I have no clue what the show is going to look like. Thank you, Milo. Thank you, Dakota. Thank you to you for watching. Okay, take care.